Hi, welcome to this video about 2 bits by Klavis. 2 bits is a so-called logic trove, and it has 2 channels with each 2 inputs. Both have a regular logic output and an inverted version of that. You can link these 2 channels with this little button here. And there's a few parameters that you can actually adjust by pressing the set button here and then by turning the according encoder. And section 2 here even has a few functions, the ones marked in orange, that actually use CV to adjust the parameters. Of course, I want to thank the people at Klavis for sending me this unit and for supporting my video about it. Let's start off by playing a few sound examples. This section is maybe rather long. It's, I think, a little bit over 10 minutes. I made each sound example a little bit longer because there's a lot of information to get across, and the only way to do that is by overlaying it on the screen. And it's not because 2 bits is a complicated module, but every function behaves differently, and I didn't think it would be useful if I played sound examples without explaining what 2 bits was doing. So let's get into some sounds, and after that I will systematically explain every function and what every input and output on 2 bits can do for us. Now let's start sending some signals into 2 bits and look at the different functions it can perform. I will route 2 gate patterns into the first section on 2 bits first. I'm running them through the scope as well, so you can see what's going in and you will be able to see what's coming out as well. So this first gate pattern is also triggering a kick drum, just to make it a little bit more clear what's going into 2 bits. Notice that even though I'm just triggering percussion samples with these gates, they are actually quite long. These are 58% duty cycle pulse waves or gates. So the first signal I'm sending in is the blue trace. It's triggering a kick drum. The second signal I'm sending in is the red trace, and this is triggering a rim shot. And if we have a closer look at channel 1 here, you can see that the inputs are labeled in 1A, in 1B. This knob here selects which logic function the first channel is performing. And let's just set it to AND for now. There's also 2 outputs. There's the regular output, and then there's an inverted version of that. But let's first just have a look at the regular output. And I will use the resulting gate pattern to open the VCA of this ripples here. And the VCO that is going in here is the middle path VCO by North Coast Synthesis. I've set it to sync and added some modulation to the pitch just so we have a little bit of variation. So the first function I want to explain is the AND function. This function is available for both channel 1 and channel 2 here. And what the AND function does is it outputs a gate when both the inputs are high. So if one or the other is high, nothing gets sent through. And you can see this on the scope as well. Then there's the OR function. The OR function is also available on the second channel of 2 bits. What the OR logic function does is it just sends out a gate whenever one or the other input is high. And you can effectively use the OR function to mix gate signals together. Let's briefly listen and look at what the inverted output is doing. This inverted output just sends out a high gate whenever the regular output is low. By the way, it might not be entirely clear, but on the scope here I have this grid, and every square represents 5 volts. So you can see that the gates that I'm sending in are something like maybe 6 or 7 volts. And the gates I'm getting out of 2 bits are 10 volts. And this is true for every function. It doesn't matter how high the gates are that you send in. As long as 2 bits recognizes it to be gates, it will send out 10 volt versions of it. Let's go to the XOR function, which is related to the OR function. This is also available on the second channel of 2 bits. What the XOR function does is it sends out a gate when one or the other inputs are high, but not when they both are high. The X really just stands for exclusive, so this is an exclusive OR function. It needs to be one or the other, but not both. And you can already see that by using boolean logic, you can use simple patterns and derive an interesting gate pattern from them to use for something else. And personally, I find it really liberating to, well, not have to think about every aspect of a patch. Like here, I'm just sending in 2 gate patterns that, well, I like for these drums. And 2 bits takes care of the pattern for the synth. I don't have to think about it. And when you get bored of this pattern, you just change to another logic function and the pattern will be a little bit different. And by the way, the inverted versions of AND, OR and XOR can also be called NAND, NOR and XNOR, which of course just stands for not AND, not OR and not XOR. And these inverted versions of the AND, OR and XOR and every other function is always available at the inverted outputs, and this will always for every function be the inverted gate of the one that's coming out of the regular output. Now let's have a look at the functions that are unique to section 1 or channel 1. And these are the set repeat function, the alternating function, -a and b, rising edge, falling edge, and both edges. I will explain what all of these do. I'm still using the blue trace, the gate pattern, to trigger a kick drum. I've changed the sample that's being triggered by the red trace into a hi-hat, and the output of 2 bits is still the yellow trace, and it, just as before, still just opens the VCA of ripples that I'm sending the middle path VCO through. I added a little bit of sequencing to the VCO again to have a little bit of variation, but that has nothing to do with 2 bits. One way to look at the set and reset function is that whatever gate signal you send into input 1A, and I say gate signal, and I have been all the time, but you can send things like LFOs in there, which I will show you when I'm done running through all the functions. So for the set and reset function, whatever you send into the first input here turns on the gate coming from the regular output, and whenever there's a gate or signal coming into the second input, input 1B, the gate coming from the output of the first logic section is turned off. And this can be a very useful function for turning on maybe like an effect, or opening a VCA that opens some kind of routing, which you then can control. You can open or activate it by sending in a signal to the input, and it just stays open even if the first input keeps receiving gates. You will see when I remove the signal from the second input that the gate coming out of 2 bits just stays high, and the gate will stay high until the second input receives a signal. Then there's the alternating function. This one might be a little bit confusing to explain. When you first select this function, it just waits until a signal is present at one of the 2 inputs. When that signal is detected, the gate will go high, and the gate coming from the output will stay high as long as the gate going into that input is high as well. Whatever the other input is receiving, it doesn't matter. It won't affect anything until the first input has gone low, and it's only then that when the second input receives a high gate, the gate at the output will go high again as well. And as long as the second input is still getting a high gate, whatever the first one is doing doesn't matter. And what 2 bits is doing there is really alternating between following the gate at one input, and then when that gate has gone low, it looks at what the other gate is doing. It's a little bit confusing, but I'm sure if you look at the diagram, it will make a little bit more sense. Maybe if I slow down my clock here by a lot, it will be a little bit more apparent. Let me stop my oscilloscope here for a moment. Here you can see that the gate output of 2 bits reacts to the blue trace here. The red trace is doing something at the same time, but that doesn't matter because it's looking at one input at a time. Then the first gate input goes low, which is also represented in the gate at the output of 2 bits. And you can see that then the blue gate goes high again, but as I already mentioned, once the output has gone down again, it will look at the other input, and because the other input, being the red trace here, is not going high, it is not doing anything, the gate at the output will stay low until the second input receives a high gate. And this is just an alternating situation, which can really be interesting for some cases. Then there's the AND, OR and XOR, which I already showed you. And then another exclusive one to the first channel is the -A AND B. And this is really just an AND function, but 2 bits inverts the logic that it receives at the first input. The gate at the output will only go high when the first input is low and the second one is high, because it inverts whatever it receives on the first channel here. The inverted output of this is really interestingly not just the inversion, well, it is, but the logic behind it is no longer an AND function, but it's rather A or -B. And again, this can be very confusing to intuitively understand, but if you look at the diagram, I'm sure you can make sense of it. Then there's the function that only reacts to rising edges. Does not matter at which input this rising edge enters the module. It reacts to both. And you can see that we get a short pulse wave from the output of 2 bits. We can actually change the length of this pulse wave by going into the setting menu. Well, I say menu, but it's really just pressing one button here. So you press the set button, and then when you turn this knob, you can change the length of the pulse wave. The range of this knob is kind of divided into 2 sections. At the left, the range of the knob goes from 0 to 20 milliseconds. And from the middle position, the range is between 20 milliseconds and 10 seconds. So then, of course, if you turn this up completely, the pulse length is 10 seconds, which in this example doesn't make any sense. So you can change the length of these pulses. And then to go out of this setting function, you press the set knob once again, and then you can see that it starts flashing. And this means that you need to turn this knob to the according function again. And you will see that once I reach the rising edge function here, that the blinking will stop. Which means I'm on the correct function again. Then there's 2 other functions. There's the falling edge function. And this is really a lot like the previous one, but this one only reacts to falling edges. And it does not matter at which input this falling edge is, it just reacts to both the channels. You can see that the pulse width of the output is narrower than the one we set in the previous function, and these can be set independently. And then there's one more function that's unique to the first channel on 2 bits, And this is the function that sends out a pulse whenever the signal at either of both the inputs is rising or falling. It does not matter if it's rising or falling, it does not matter which input is doing so, it will always send out a pulse wave. And again, we can set the length of this pulse by going into the setting mode and turning the knob. And sometimes when you go into the setting mode, turning the knob doesn't immediately change anything, and this is because in this mode the knob also needs to catch up to the previous setting. Then to go out, you do the same thing again. Now let's have a look at the functions of channel 2 of 2 bits. I've changed up my patch. I'm using a probability gate coming from Zularic repetitor as the blue trace. I'm sending this one into the first input on the second channel labeled into A. And this pulse wave is triggering the clap. Then there's this red trace, which is a gate coming from a clock divider. It is a divide by 5. This gate is going into the second input of channel 2 on 2 bits. And this gate is also triggering a kick drum. Currently I have the regular output of channel 2 patched through the scope as well. It is the yellow cable and the yellow trace, and this is used to open a low pass gate. I'm using Omen for this by Herzlich Labs. Through this low pass gate I've routed a triangle wave coming from Generate 3 with a little bit of sequencing on there, so it's not too boring. Let's quickly run through the regular logic functions on channel 2 with this patch. These functions behave exactly the same way as the first channel of 2 bits, but since this is another patch with, well, a longer gate and a shorter combined, it might be interesting to just show you quickly how those sound. So this is the AND gate. The output of 2 bits will only go high when both of these top 2 traces are high. And the inverted output does the inverted version of that. Let me use this opportunity to show you how you can chain channel 1 to channel 2. To chain the output or the inverse output of channel 1 to channel 2, you just need to press this little button here. When just the on LED is lit up, it's the regular output that's being chained through to channel 2. And currently that output is low, as you can see from this LED. And because channel 2 is on the AND setting and the channels are linked, it now looks at 3 inputs. And all 3 inputs need to be high for the output to present a high gate as well. So the blue trace and the red trace are going in here. There's 0 or no gate at all coming from channel 1. So they will never be high, all 3. And this results in the gate not triggering at all. So when I want to use the inverted output, which at this moment is of course a high gate because it's the inverted version of the first output, to use this inverse output to virtually link to channel 2, we press this button again. And then you can see that the blue LED here is lit up. And this means that indeed we are using the inverted output of channel 1. And as this is constantly high, it will allow the gate at the output of channel 2 to trigger when the two other signals that are going in here are high as well. So whenever you chain channel 1 to channel 2 will always look at 3 inputs. At least for the regular logic functions. Let's listen to the OR function. The output of this is always high at the moment because we have still changed channel 1 to channel 2, and channel 1 is always sending a high gate because the inverted output is linked and this is high. So let's remove the chaining. Well, in fact, let me send in another gate to channel 1 here. And let us listen to the sound that this gate is triggering. So this is not going through the scope, but you can see here when the red LED for the first output of the first channel is lit up, the gate output is high, and when we link this output will be virtually linked to the second channel, and now the OR function is looking at 3 signals again. And because we are on the OR function, the gate at the output will go high whenever one of the 3 inputs is high. If we switch back to the AND section, you will see that using the 2 channels linked gives us a lot more variation than we would have with just 1 channel. Let's turn off the chaining again. Let's listen to the XOR function on channel 2. Let's remove this. So the XOR function, again, just as before, only opens when one gate or the other is high, but never when both are high. And this also applies to the chaining. At the moment I've chained a low gate, so this has no effect, but when I chain the inverted gate from channel 1, you can see that the gate at the output of channel 2 turns off when all 3 inputs are high. And by 3 inputs, of course, again, I mean these 2 inputs and then the virtual one that we linked. Now let's have a listen to what the gator function on channel 2 does. The gator is kind of a gate merger. It lets through all the gates or pulses or triggers that you send into the inputs. And whenever there's a trigger or a gate going high while one of the other is high, this function will re-trigger instead of just staying high, which is different from a regular AND or OR function. We can set the gap between the triggers, because when the gate is high and the function receives a second gate being high, well, for it to make any sense, it first needs to close down and then it re-triggers. And this gap can be user adjusted by going into the setting mode and turning this knob. The range of the knob is just like before, between 1 millisecond and 20 milliseconds at the center here. From there it goes to 10 seconds. Now let's listen to the vote section. The vote section acts like a majority vote. Both inputs need to agree. This is what's written in the manual. They both need to be high for the output to go high as well. And this might sound exactly the same as an AND gate, and when you're just using two channels, it is. But when we link channel 1 to channel 2, it really makes more sense to look at this as a majority vote, because as long as two of the inputs, be it the actual inputs or the virtual inputs, as long as two of these three are high, the output will be high as well. So just like with most things in life, the majority wins. Let me send in a gate into the first channel. And again, this is not running through the scope, but you can watch this LED. Now let's have a look at the random or probability gate, the comparator section, the clock divider, and the pulse delay features of channel 2 of 2 bits. These orange functions indicate that you can have CV control over them, and this CV signal can be sent into the second input of channel 2. So right now I'm sending in a steady clock pulse into the first input of channel 2, input 2A. We are on the random function. You could look at this as a probability gate. Currently, I'm not sending in any CV signal, and I'm using the output, the regular output of channel 2, to open the VCA on this ripples filter. The random or probability gate lets us choose the probability that pulses are getting through to the output. And by the way, the blue signal is the steady clock that I'm sending in. I'll use the red trace for CV, and the yellow trace shows the output of the second channel of 2 bits. So, as you already can see here, there's sometimes a pulse that's being skipped, and you can set the probability just like before by going into the setting mode. And when we turn this knob to the left, you can see that nothing is changing. This is because the knob needs to catch up to its previous value, which is somewhere here. And now when I turn it to the left, once it has catched up, you can see that when I turn this knob completely to the left, the probability that a pulse is getting through is very close to 0, probably just 1%. And when I turn the probability up, there's a higher chance that the pulses are getting through. And of course, when I turn this completely to the right, the probability is close to 100%. Now, before I send in a CV signal, I want to demonstrate to you that you can even use pulses that aren't the same width. So, as you can see here on the blue trace, which is the pulse train that I'm sending in, this gate changes in length. And you can see that this variation is present at the output as well. So let me put this at a center value here and go out of the setting mode by pressing the set knob and going to the right function again, which is still the random. And let me now send in a CV signal. It's routed through the scope, it's the red trace. And you connect this CV signal to the second input here. And now when I turn down the control voltage to about -5 volts, you can see that again the probability of the gate getting through is, well, almost 0. And when I turn up the CV, the probability is close to 100. For those wondering, the setting you make here internally acts as an offset. To demonstrate this, let me detach the CV signal and let me go into the setting. And I'll turn up the probability manually. Now let me go out of this set mode, like this. And now when I turn down the control voltage to -5 volts, of course I need to reconnect it here. You can see that we're not as near to 0 as we were before. Let's remove the control voltage again. Now I'll demonstrate the comparator section. To make sense of the comparator section, it's probably important to know what it does. Usually a comparator sends out a high gate whenever the voltage that we're sending in exceeds a certain threshold. And sometimes we can set this threshold manually. On other comparator modules, you can send in a second CV, in which case the comparator compares one CV signal to the other one, and if one is higher than the other one, it will send out a gate. On 2 bits, this works similarly, but you send in a CV signal into the second input here, because the first one will always expect gates, or at least it will convert anything that you send in here into gates. So to use the comparator inside 2 bits, you send the CV signal into the CV input. You can see that when I turn up this CV signal, which is still the red trace, we are getting a high gate out of the output of 2 bits here. And when I turn it to 0, the gate closes. And you can set the threshold for this manually. I accidentally detuned ripples here. Maybe that's a good thing. So we're hearing something else now. So I turn down the threshold for the comparator manually to, something like 9 o'clock here. Let me go out of the set mode like this. And now even with the CV signal going in at 0, we're getting a high gate. You'll see when I turn down the control voltage that at some point the gate closes. And this is because the control voltage that we are sending in does no longer exceed the threshold that we set manually here. You can still use the gate input of channel 2, and by sending in a high gate, the functionality of the comparator inverts. And this means that instead of the comparator sending out a high gate when the CV we're sending in exceeds a certain threshold, it will send out the gate when the CV is below a certain threshold. So when the gate we are sending into the first input is low, the comparator does not send out a gate when the CV signal we're sending in is below the threshold, which we set at about 9 o'clock. I guess this is something like -3 volts. And when I send in a high gate, like this, it inverts the logic of the comparator section. Now let's have a look at the clock divider and multiplier. Let's remove the CV signal for now. And you can see at the moment the clock we are sending in, which is still the blue trace, is exactly the same as the clock we're getting out of the second channel on 2 bits. But we can change this by setting the divider or multiplier manually. Like this. You can go a lot slower. And the divisions and multipliers are all powers of 2, so divide by 2, divide by 4, divide by 8, divide by 16, the same for the multiplication. Let me leave it here. Let's go out of the set mode. And then of course we can control this with CV. And the setting we did manually here is an offset for that CV. So if I now send in a negative voltage, the divisions will slow down. And when I turn up the voltage, the multiplications go up. And by the way, on these CV functions here, you can still chain the first section of 2 bits into the second one. And whatever the result is of the logic up here, right now output 1 of the first section of 2 bits is sending out nothing, or a low gate. I've linked the regular output, and this low gate kind of shuts off the second channel of 2 bits entirely. Now when I chain the inverted output, which is high at the moment, the signal is getting through again. And the last function on the second channel of 2 bits is the pulse delay. Let me first unmute a VCO that I'm opening with the steady clock here. And in fact, let me make the length of that clock a little bit random. And now I will unmute ripples, which is being opened by the pulse coming out of 2 bits. You can see at the moment there is no delay. Well, the delay is 1 millisecond. Now turning the set knob to the right increases the pulse delay we're getting. And again, the range is from 1 to 20 milliseconds in the middle here, and then it goes to 10 seconds. And it's a little bit hard to see on the scope. If I zoom in a little bit, you should be able to see that there's indeed a slight delay between the pulses that I'm sending into the first input of channel 2 here and the pulses that are coming out. Let me tune ripples up so we can hear it a little bit better. And this can become very musical if you set the delay right. Now again, we can control this with CV as well. And turning the control voltage up increases the delay time. And turning it down decreases the delay time. Of course, there's going to be these glitches when you're changing the value. This also occurs when you change the value on here. But I find this useful to create some separation between two sounds. And it's cool to have CV control over that. And of course, just as before, for all these CV functions, the inverted output just sends out the inverted version of the gate we're getting out of the regular output. You can use the XOR logic section to ring modulate two VCOs. Let me connect a sine wave to the first input, and let me also zoom in a little bit here. I'm going to connect a sine wave to the second logic input as well. So now there's a sine wave, which is the blue trace, going into the first input on channel 1, and there's another sine wave, the red trace, going into the second input here. And now these two signals are being XORed together. And if we then just listen to the output, it's going through the scope as well. And I play around with the tuning. You can hear that we're getting something that resembles ring modulation, but it's a digital version of it. And you can get really gnarly results with this. Let me route this XORed signal through an MA35, which is an MS10 clone filter. And this also demonstrates that you can send LFOs into 2 bits or VCOs in this case. So I've turned 2 bits to the end setting. We're monitoring the voltage that I'm sending in, and the output of 2 bits will only send out a signal when both inputs are high. And now if we monitor the voltage that I'm sending in, which is the blue section here, you can see that from the moment that I hit 1.75, 2 bits looks at this voltage as a high gate. And if I turn it down, it goes down again at around 1.3. So there's a little bit of a difference there. There's another interesting feature of 2 bits, which is probably a little bit hard to demonstrate, but I'll show you anyway. You can OR the outputs, which means that, well, just like the OR function on the regular logic sections here, when an OR function receives 2 high gates, it will just send out a high gate. It's not like they are added up, which could result in voltages exceeding 20 volts, which can of course damage some modules. An OR function just uses logic. When it receives 1 gate, it goes high. When it receives 2 gates, it goes high. When it receives no gates, it does not go high. So by connecting the 2 outputs of 2 bits together with something like a stackable, you can OR the outputs of these 2 sections as well. And usually it's a really bad idea to connect outputs together, and you shouldn't do this on any module really. And this is a rather unique functionality to 2 bits, that you can in fact connect these 2 outputs together And then these outputs are just ORed together, which just means that the output will send out a high gate whether one or the other or both of the outputs of 2 bits are high. This is going to be it for my video about 2 bits by Klavis. The build quality of this module is just great. These little knobs on some modules by other manufacturers, these little potentiometers can be very wobbly, but these are pretty sturdily mounted on here. There's a little bit of give, but not a lot. This little set knob and chain knob here feel really okay as well. There's a click when you press it, so you get some sensory and auditory feedback that you have actually pressed it. The LEDs are great as well. They show you what's going on. They're not too bright. You can see that the LEDs on the Zone BF here by AOWave, sometimes I feel they're a little bit too bright. So there's none of that on 2 bits, which I really like. And all in all, it's a really versatile logic module with 2 sections that you can chain together in interesting ways. The CV section here is a nice surprise, and by adding these features here, 2 bits becomes more than just a logic module. Thanks again to the people at Klavis for sending me this unit and for supporting the video about it. If there's any questions, please leave them in the comments. And by the way, I've uploaded a PDF with all the logic functions explained in a simple and easy to understand diagram. You can download that PDF. The link to it is in the description box. I really hope you learned something. Thank you very much for watching this video. Bye.